Hello, everyone. Welcome to the IERLab Podcast. Now, who is IERLab? IERLab is the Influencer Ethnography Research Lab located at Curtin University in Perth, Western Australia. What do? We specialize in the methodologies and the pedagogies of influencer research. I'm your host, Walter Lee, coming to you all the way from South Korea to bring you, our listeners, a more in-depth look on what's going on in the world of influencer cultures. Our series will feature researchers, scholars, and students on influencer culture. Today, we will be focusing on the topic of green influencers. They are the kind of influencers who use their platform to give useful tips and insights to be greener and help make this world better. I love watching these types of influencers, and I'm glad that I get the opportunity to talk to someone who is looking more deeply into this area. Today's guest is a PhD candidate in media, culture, and social inquiry at university. Her current ethnographic research examines social movements and storytelling on TikTok with a focus on climate action. She is a self-confessed gamer, while at the same time studying online, offline communities, playing MMORPGs at internet cafes. Welcome to the show, Naomi Robinson.
Thank you so much, Walter. Happy to be here.
What kind of games are you into?
At the moment, it's a bit sad, but Overwatch 2, World of Warcraft, that's where I'm at the moment.
Yes, well, obviously it's huge here as well in Korea. I'm not so much into the PC games, but it's I know how big they are. It's basically another world within this world. So
yeah.
But anyway, it's a recurring first question on the podcast, but it would be great to know how you got into the subject of green influences. Like, have you had a long-term interest in becoming greener yourself? And what is the importance you place on looking further into this topic?
Yeah, so I suppose to answer this question, it's important to go back to the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
So I've always been an internet person, and I've always been really concerned about the climate crisis, similar to many listeners, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
And as you mentioned, I've studied and worked across different research topics and industries, but my research focus on TikTok and climate action was somewhat serendipitous, I would say. So when I approached the idea of doing this TikTok, I was working in branding and communications at a nonprofit organization while I was finishing my second master's in creative industries, where I was sort of weaving climate narratives into a television script.
Okay.
And so my intent with all of my research, and then sometimes even my creative projects, has always been to examine that intersection between technology, human sociality, connection, and personal political topics like feminism, identity, and the climate crisis. Yeah. It's
quite interesting that, like, though we are trying to move towards a greener world that we live in, we often see this on, our mobile phones that take a lot of maybe waste, electrical waste, and they're not actually properly discarded in the right way. So we've still got so long. We're getting there, but we have a long way to go, I think.
Yeah, and I definitely think all of those sort of debates are really interesting, right? Because it almost feels like in order to have that like technological evolution that could help the climate crisis, there needs to be like some quote unquote damage to be done as well. So it's really this like double-edged sword. So yeah, I really enjoy sort of following those sort of conversations.
Yeah, if you don't mind me asking, are you a vegetarian or are you someone who tries to, use less like clothes that are like of hemp material or green material?
So I would say that so I'm not vegetarian, and in terms of sort of my carbon footprint and things like that, I am very conscious of it. However, I am aware that sort of I'm of the ethos that while each of us can, recycle a milk carton, and that's great, I think we've sort of moved to that point beyond there where we need to be focusing on changing policies, changing the cost of plastics, things like that, to really make that change, because it's all good and fine for the onus to be on individuals, but there needs to be sort of a greater societal and like political debate about this. So yeah, it's interesting. So while I am very conscious, I do recycle, I do like those little things. I try not to invest too much in fast fashion and things like that.
Mhm.
It is hard, especially in, the socioeconomic climate we live in today. So yeah.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I completely understand. I do my best. Here in Korea, there is a really, I think we need more green influences because we are a country that just basically wastes so much trash. I mean, the fact that we have 24-hour delivery service and they come in plastic containers. And I
Mm.
know that Korea is working towards more of a greener future by 2030, I believe. But yeah, I feel horrible. Though I recycle, I also get a lot of delivery food. So
Mhm.
anyway, but green influencing, I'm sure it goes back further than social media because a lot of things that I've figured out when talking to other researchers is that there is always like an area that it was born from, and it's usually before social media. But are you aware of like one of the first generation green influences on social media?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question because in situating sort of my research design, I did a lot of background to see the lay of the land. And it's somewhat difficult to say when green influences emerged on the landscape, especially depending on your definition of influences, but also deciding on what makes them green. Because there have been a lot of people that are in the public eye that have been discussing climate change for 20 or 30 years. And so in my early days of sort of watching influencers in my personal life, it was one of my forms of escapism, right? And
Hmm.
so I would purposefully go towards entertainment rather than informational content. But
Hmm.
in my deep dive for climate related content on social media, I saw a lot of bloggers in the early 2010s gaining mainstream traction. So, they were featured like on mainstream news articles and things like that. But a really obvious answer for the social media age is the really prolific presence of someone like Greta Thunberg, who is
Yes.
an absolutely stellar example of activists, crossing that social media boundary to extend their voices online.
Hmm.
And from a very sort of macro view, without doing any sort of longitudinal or like statistical analysis, I definitely noticed a rise or perhaps a normalization, or maybe even just a more visible presence of climate conscious social media users and influencers from around 2018 onwards, which was right where Greta really sort of started that wave of change. Yeah.
Yes, like I was actually going to bring up Greta Thunberg because like I didn't know, like I don't think she didn't become famous on social media per se.
Mm,
She spoke at that it was at the UN, one of the UN conferences. Um and that's where she blew up. She sort of blew up on national news before I think it kind of spread to social media, and a lot of, it was a very 50-50 with her from what I saw from
mm,
reactions. Some people really supported her, saw her as a future leader. Other
mm,
people were on the other side saying, why are we taking this advice from a young girl who doesn't know something or other? But
mm,
I remember it being such a big influence on climate change, social media pages that,
mm,
yeah, she's definitely what I saw her recently, actually. She kind of went quiet for a couple of years, but I saw her recently doing some activities on social media. So, I
mm,
mean, she was a positive influence in the right direction, I think.
mm.
Now, talking about green influences, there are so many, and as you mentioned, like people, doing fun things to help the environment, climate change influences, etc. Uh, like for me, I've only seen the good tip ones, like maybe you should do this instead of doing that, and I think that's actually really useful because there's a lot of things I didn't know. But
Mm.
was there an influencer that caught your attention, specifically your eye, and did it make you look deeper into that person or that influencer?
Yeah, so I think it's important to clarify that there are a lot of terms for what I'm calling a green influencer. So there's like
Okay.
eco, environmental, sustainability influencers. So rather than maybe speaking about a particular influencer, it was more so like the variety of users that was really compelling for me to see. So
Hmm.
there were those branded sort of under sustainability, which they sort of focus on ethical fashion, on clean eco living, on zero waste lifestyles. And I would say that's probably the larger portion of that green content you see out there.
Hmm.
Um, And then, which is exactly what you mentioned, it's those tips and, lifestyle hacks for living a greener life. And then there's other influencers who sort of focus on environmentalist rhetoric. So they're the ones that are speaking about eco-communication and policies, about conservation and wildlife, and even about environmental justice. And then there's some influencers who are very concerned with activism, protesting, social movements, and they're really advocates for social change, equity, and equality. But then you also see collectives that sort of pool their resources as nonprofits or as social movements. So, for example, you've got Schools for Change, which sees school-aged users speaking about the climate crisis, organizing school strikes inspired by Greta. Then there's accounts like EcoTalk Collective, which is on TikTok. And that's a group of around 18, I believe, climate change educators that started in 2020 to sort of explore a bunch of the themes that I mentioned just then. And then a really interesting one that I like to point out is Earthrise Studio, who have quite a large presence on Instagram. But they're a media company of a group of creatives that are making stories to transform climate conversations. And on a personal note, that Earthrise Studio was co-founded by two YouTubers who I used to watch back in the day that got me interested in influencers. So Jack and Finn Harries, who are now filmmakers, they're designers, alongside Alice 80, I believe her name is.
Yes,
who's
I've seen her.
Yeah, so she's also a filmmaker, climate and social justice campaigner, which is really cool. But yeah, it was really interesting to sort of stumble upon them all these years later and sort of see how, their online content has shifted and where their priorities lie. And then a final thing I might just say is that when we're talking about green influencing and that sort of thing, is that companies and organizations really tap into that social media to join in the very common climate positive mandates now. So, we see like massive organizations like the UN, obviously having quite a big social media presence, but also people like TikTok and Meta, who both have companies like TikTok and like there's some sort of sentient entity. TikTok and Meta, they both have policies and initiatives in place to cut their carbon emissions as businesses, but then also sort of platform grassroots organizations or spotlight individuals who are sort of in this climate conversation realm. So it's definitely in this sea of content that got me interested in the different types of climate conversations happening online, because it's not sort of just a static example one way or another. Yeah.
Thank you for clearing up, like, as you mentioned, like it's green influencer might be the umbrella term, but there is obviously all these different kinds of green influencers under it, right? Like you said. And I don't think many people would know about that, to be honest with you. I think that a lot of people would just call them green influencers and not really think about maybe the specifics of each influencer or what they're trying to achieve or what they're trying to do. So it's really fascinating to hear that. So from what you've studied so far, have you seen a positive reaction from the public in regard to, let's say, following these tips or give the information that they're given out from these influencers? Do they seem to get mainly positive reviews?
Yeah, so I have seen obviously the positive and also the negative. But one of the things that I love about social media is the power to educate and empower through memes, right? But also provide a space that people could potentially script thought-provoking short videos. They can use social media to amplify calls for action. They can offer commentaries about what's going on in the world, but also the capacity to simply share or repost or comment on content that can have a really positive impact on the world. And when you think about the numbers, even for micro influencers, and for the sake of this example, let's just say 5,000 followers, with the understanding that they could also reach audiences beyond those numbers, there is just in those numbers clear evidence that communities are being impacted, and mostly positively. Otherwise, those followers wouldn't exist, right? But I think this might also be a really good time to sort of talk about short video cultures specifically, and the way anyone can have a viral video. So opposed to an influencer who might carefully curate a brand around one of the green areas I mentioned earlier, any user could really have a viral moment that could lead to a snowball effect, including starting online trends or online discussions about the climate, whether that's good or bad. But that delicate dance, I think, between platforms is also really interesting, because some accounts and some content succeeds really well on TikTok, but not Instagram, or on YouTube and not Twitter. And so, yeah, it's really interesting for me to sort of see that varied content and that varied approach to social media, because it really can be anything, but then the algorithms are at play, the platform features are at play, and it's all about sort of tapping into those to get the messages across. Yeah.
I don't know if you've looked this deep into it yet, but did you figure out like the sort of the, how can I say, the ages that were more likely to, use this information? Like, was it like a younger generation, like the Gen Zers, or was it like middle age, like 30s, 40s, or was it a lot older? Or was it just a very big mixture of all these people that were watching these videos?
Well, I can't give you a definitive answer from my own research. I will say that, like historically, especially apps like TikTok have been considered very much a younger app, right? It's for Gen Z. I will say that I feel like it's also a millennial app. But it is interesting because, there's this assumption that social media is for younger people. But even if that's the case, it's a really important and a really important thing to be researching, because you can't dismiss the way that these people are sort of getting their daily knowledge, right? They often trust media outlets less and less, and trust their peers more and more. So yeah, it's a really interesting balance to sort of think about.
That's quite interesting because like you said, I think TikTok is definitely, there obviously are older people that use TikTok. I know in Instagram, I know plenty of like maybe, I guess, elderly influencers that use it. But I imagine just as a stubborn millennial that only Gen Zers are like interested in like dancing or like sort of makeup stuff or whatever. But yes. At the end of the day, though, I think we all want a cleaner world to live in. Granted, before I had my daughter, I wasn't so much into, taking care of it so much. But now being a father, I've obviously changed my mind, and things are now, I need to look after this earth for my daughter to live in it cleanly. But there are these group activists that some might deem as extreme leftists, and they do dangerous things or damage property, disrupt the public, etc. And this is in order to get their message across. Now, this could influence many young, naive people to do the same. So do you think this behavior is dangerous, or is it just a misrepresentation of them on the media?
So I think I'll start by just saying that misinformation and disinformation are, of course, highly prevalent on social media. So there's so much content online, and sometimes it could be seen that the issue with everyone having a voice is that everyone has a voice. So how can people find that accurate information if most of it looks credible, even though some of it might not be? So people might turn to things like the news to see if they can corroborate what they've heard online. But I think the relationship between traditional media outlets and social media can sometimes be a bit muddy. So I'm sure everyone noticed the boom of TikTok during the pandemic, and it not only forced media outlets to sort of use TikTok and other social media as a means to communicate and potentially stay relevant, but it also made social media become even more mainstream, because during the lockdowns, people were interacting online more than ever, right? And this also meant that people began to trust, like I said, their peers more and more and more. And then the traditional outlets, sort of were seen to have a few biases and that sort of thing. But then, as you said, when you have climate activists who do things for shock value, that can have negative effects, including giving other activists bad names, right? But other times, disruptions can sort of be seen as more sinister than they actually are. I like to give the example of the activists who were throwing paint or food on famous artworks in museums. And there was such a negative narrative around this for a while. And then the activists had to clarify that they knew the artworks were protected by glass. So they essentially used that viral media frenzy that they knew would happen to shine a light on their cause. And so to answer your other question, whether disruptive behavior is influential to young people, it's really hard to say. But if we talk about hypothetical questions about younger generations being angry that their future is in jeopardy because of past inaction, that could very well be more influential than seeing people shut down motorways or throw liquid onto art, right? So it's definitely an interesting time if you're thinking about it from this perspective, because desperation can make people behave drastically. And then if you add in the fact that younger generations both express themselves online, but also consume sociocultural knowledge online, social media really does become that hub for change. So with anything, right, you're taking the positive with the negative. Yeah.
That was an amazing answer. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
That was really good. And it really opened my eyes to a lot of things as well. Like, sometimes we might be all guilty of it. But as soon as we see something online, we maybe judge it as soon as we see it. And like sometimes I would look at like those activists in a way and go, oh, I don't understand what you're doing, or you're disrupting the public. But when the media is the one that's reporting on it, obviously they're not going to talk about the details of it. They just want to get the shock value, because at the end of the day, news is entertainment. But sadly, it's not about, always showing the real thing. But listen, we're coming to the end of our interview, but I would like to know, like, do you have any tips to make sure that like the public chooses the right green influencer? Like, are there some tells where you might think it's best to avoid this page, or like it seems a little bit uneducated, for example?
Yeah, it's certainly a hard thing to navigate. Even sustainability influencers have been accused of having online profiles that don't match their offline lives, or others, claim a product is carbon neutral or ethically sourced, and then it's later proven incorrect due to either purposeful concealment by the influencer or the influencer not researching a product enough, right? And then it doesn't match their ethos or their values. And unfortunately, there are also cases where the quote unquote right influencers to follow simply don't have the traction yet to reach everybody. And so, views often, dictate like how successful an influencer is, but is that information, the best information that could be there, or are there other creators, other grassroots movements that could be giving you more accurate information?
I think in many cases, like you're right. So especially for like I guess let's call them less popular influencers, I think they tend to usually start off really, genuine and, want the right message to be put across. But once you have the pressure of being such a larger influencer, one with, millions of followers or whatever, I feel like you're expected to pump out content, and sometimes that content wasn't real well researched, or something. It's just something that you had to do to stay relevant. And I don't like that whole situation that we've gotten into, is like, we have to stay relevant if you want to be a social media. But that's a very good point.
Yeah. And sometimes to that point, there are often, that is that tension between an influencer's motivations and, the message that they want to get across in the case of climate, right? Because it's all dependent on what the viewers want to see and what the algorithm likes. So sometimes that means you have to go for the sort of kitschy or, trend-worthy video construction, rather than going for something that's really hard-hitting or that spells out all the facts that can be quite depressing or something like that. So yeah, that's really interesting. I will also just mention, sort of as a side note, that a lot of social media platforms are trying to actively remove harmful misinformation. And I think that's definitely a step in the right direction, but it's not a perfect science. So at the end of the day, everyone has a responsibility to themselves to determine what they want to believe in. And the first tip I have for this is that views do not equate to the truth, although there is some causation there, right? So people need to make sure that they don't take anything online as face value. So it doesn't hurt to take a few minutes to fact check what you're hearing, even if it's from a personality that you trust, because of that wishy-washy sort of nature of social media that we just mentioned. And then, of course, if you're new to the topic, I would suggest using hashtags to sift through information, finding external press or even platform spotlights of creators. And then once you find accounts that you like, check and see what other accounts they mention and follow, because that can often, be a nod in the right direction. So yeah, those are just a few of my tips.
Yeah. Well, like actually, I love that you made the point of, doing more like research on the situation because obviously I mean my daughter's only 8 months, she's not going to touch social media for quite some time, but like the whole thing is it's just a part of life now and I can't stop her from doing it, but I want to teach her that don't believe everything you see, and if this, just take everything with a grain of salt and do some more research upon it before making a conclusion to what you want to do. And I know that these days, I think a lot of people are just taking everyone's word of their favorite influencer, no matter what they say. It almost becomes like, in a way, not a cult, but whatever they say is truth. And those people are going to believe it regardless of the evidence that's behind it or not. So it is very important that we do more research and make sure we have the facts correct before we start spreading anything else out there. But now, Naomi, it's been fantastic to have you on today's podcast. But before you go, is there anything you'd like to promote or any future studies, current works that's something that you would want to talk about?
Yeah, so while I don't have anything personal to mention at the moment, I have a lot of work in progress things happening.
Yes.
I will promote the TikTok Cultures Research Network, the TCRN. That's also housed at Curtin University for anyone who's wanting to stay in the loop about TikTok research. It's a really great space for like-minded scholars who are sort of right at the forefront of the field. So yeah, that's definitely a spot and a nod in the right direction for me.
Okay. Yeah. That's awesome. Thank you very much to everyone for listening to today's episode of the IERLab podcast. Once again, thank you to today's guest, Naomi Robinson.
Thank you so much.
And until next time, this has been Walter Lee. You may click on your next adventure now.